What is the culture of a D&D setting, and why is it important? Well, if on one side of the continent, teasing someone about their clothes could be seen as a sign of affection, and on the other side it means pistols at dawn, that's important. When I say setting, I don't really mean the whole game world like Faerun, but rather whatever distinct portion of the game world you're running your game in. In the case of Faerun, we'd say the Sword Coast, or Cormyr, or Thay. It can be a nation, a region, a city, or even a neighborhood, depending on how zoomed in you are. Making those portions of the world culturally distinct from one another means the party will feel at home in some places and like strangers in others. It makes the world feel larger and more lived in. It makes where we choose to go and how we act when we get there feel significant. Hello, I'm Skele, the ADHDM, and it would be easy to spend hours choosing every tradition and folk way, and then end up with pages and pages of things we wouldn't use or remember. So as usual, I'd like to systematize it so we can expend less effort for more effective results. I want to use a checklist to generate a culture that feels authentic to the players. When I say culture, I'm not referring to the clothes that they wear, the languages they speak, or even the holidays and customs observed in the land. These are just lists of things, and they are not the information we need to express our setting to the players. All of that can come later, and a lot more easily, once we establish the setting's normative values. How a person living in the culture thinks things should be. You may rightfully be thinking that your own next-door neighbor doesn't share your normative values, so how can we possibly ascribe any to a whole country? Well, lucky for us, we have not only sociological but narrative tools at our disposal. Giving our setting a general sense of what the values would be in a crowd of mainstream common people, or even inside someone's home, is going to tell us a lot more about that place than anything like a source book. It can also tell us what the divergent cultures and countercultures are. Just like when we designed our factions last week, making any kind of statement about one group lets us determine what other kinds of relationships with those values are possible. To grossly oversimplify centuries of study, we can say that there are two entities, the individual and the state, and that society, culture, is where those things interface. The individual looks at society from one direction. How can I attain well-being and acceptance? And the state looks at it from another. How can we direct and supervise our desired status quo without disruption? Each perspective suggests a set of rules that, if obeyed, will result in a desired outcome. In the case of the state, that's usually the rule of law. In the case of the individual, we get less codified but still socially enforced mores. Oftentimes, obeying a law will violate a more and vice versa. The friction and behavior generated by these rules is society. Since interactions in D&D are represented using individual characters instead of armies or nations, we can focus on individual normative values rather than those of the state. As we discover those, and tell stories about them, the state values will start to form. What values you explore, as well as what the extremes of those values are, can all derive from what theme you want your campaign to embody. Since D&D doesn't have much of a native genre, instead aiming for broad compatibility with all kinds of fantasy, it's up to us to make sure all of our work points in the same direction. If the theme of your setting is absolute power corrupts absolutely, then your adherence to and exceptions from that theme can be present in everything we do. That kind of consistency might sound like a tough task, but it actually creates a built-in structure that we can use to determine what is the best use of our prep time. In other words, what kind of story is going to unfold around the players. The overall theme of my latest setting, Montes Caro, is when justice is prevented, it becomes revenge. More specifically, the oppressed will always find a way to liberation, and if it doesn't happen through reform, it will happen through retribution. Probably because I live in the United States, and more specifically in Texas, this setting started as a colony of an old and powerful country, Cantonia, with a strong sense of hierarchical and hereditary order. But Montes Caro has proven a hard land to tame, and generations of war and revolution have strengthened its sense of identity. The country has revolted, divided, been conquered and reconquered again. Now the old world has a weaker grasp than ever. The Montescaran people have a strong identity that has nothing to do with who's in charge. So the villains in this setting are typically those whose relationship with the status quo is one of maintaining or increasing a chokehold on the vulnerable and desperate. And the heroes are those who sacrifice their resources to overturn that chokehold. Maybe you don't have a theme yet, but you do know the tone you want to strike, or have an example you want to draw on. In that case, use those to determine the values, and then loop back around to find your theme. In this case, if I didn't know my theme, I'd say, I want this to be like spaghetti westerns, post-Age of Napoleon Italy, samurai movies, and independence-era Mexico. I want the good guys to be like Alexander Dumas' protagonist, Zorro, and Puss in Boots, and the bad guys to be pompous, scheming authority figures. So how do we determine our setting's values? I have 9 cultural facets, and I start by asking, on a scale from one extreme to the other, what is this setting's relationship with each of them? First is authority, which goes from protection, authority should be used to protect and provide for us in exchange for adhering to the rules, to autonomy. Authority should keep its nose out of my business and allow us all to live for ourselves. Next is wealth, from stability. Those who have money, land, and other resources should be entitled to keep them. To opportunity. Resources should change hands frequently, and any enterprising individual should be able to gain or lose a fortune in a moment. Then we have conflict. From planning on the left, no one should rush into conflict because the consequences are just too unpredictable and it will disrupt the way things are. To action. Strike while the iron is hot, without wasting a moment. Fourth is history, which goes from tradition. We should honor our legacy. It's our job as the inheriting generation to uphold everything that came before. To change. Legacy is a curse, and we should rebuild our world with each new day. Up next is education, which ranges from formal. Everyone in the accepted group should be educated to the same standard and by the same institution. To folk. Learn from the people around you. They know your world, and they know what hardships you will face. Then we have the wild, starting with suppression. We should master the surrounding dangers of nature, or we will never be free. And then preservation. We can and should survive the dangers of the wild, but without disrupting it. Without nature, we lose our place in the world. Seventh is magic. With divine on the left, true power comes from the gods and is wielded by their trusted servants. And on the right, arcane magic. Magic is a resource that must be understood and expanded until reality itself can be rewritten. Eighth is religion. Much like education, it goes from formal. Our interface with the divine should be structured and consistent with the wisest at the top of the hierarchy, to bulk. Each of us serves the gods in our own way, and even by different names. Finally, we have death. On one end, we have acceptance. It should be normal to witness death and understand that our lives are just one small part of our body's relationship with nature. And on the other end, rejection. If we can account for every possible threat to our lives, we can prolong them. I put 6 squares between the 2 diametric relationships to each value. It's an even number, so we can't take the coward's route and choose neutral stances. For each line, I fill in a square that has the most interesting or appropriate interaction with the theme, or feels most in line with the reference material. You can go with your gut here, and don't be afraid to step outside your own normative values. Now we have a visual representation of our setting's culture, something we can look at and say, okay, how do these people feel about this? And because each extreme has varying levels of support, that gives us shortcuts to create factions later. The mainstream group believes that death is natural and should be accepted. Well, here's this branch sect that wants to all become liches and live forever. Most people think that education should happen in one's local community. Well, here's an organization pushing for a formal institution so their society can catch up with the rest of the world. After that, I like to group these together and then put them into words, 1 or 2 sentences for each value. I've grouped them together based on how much they inform one another, and it's just for my own convenience. You won't miss out on anything by grouping them up differently or just doing them all individually. Here's how it looks for Montescaro. Our first group is authority and wealth. There is a slight leaning towards autonomy from authority and a heavy leaning towards opportunities for wealth. So, in Montescaro, authority should keep the worst dangers at bay, but no good person should live in fear of the law. Those who hoard wealth or live off of the work of others are cowards. A Montescaran should win their fortune with boldness. Our next group is conflict, history, and education. There's an extreme belief in decisive action during conflict, a slight leaning towards change in history, and a slight leaning towards folk education. That tells me that arguments, like wars, should be settled in a decisive instant. Pistols, swords, or the adjudication of a priest can settle this whole affair right now. In any case, it is the gods who will decide. Montescaro has changed names, borders, and hands many times. What never changes is its spirit. The churches will teach you to live as the saints did, and the university will teach you how to live as they do in Cantonia, Luxembourg, or Palaison. But to live as a Montescaran, you must learn from the greatest of teachers. Hardship. Surviving in the arid scrubland to the north, or the stormy bays of the eastern coast, sweating to learn your trade from those around you, and watching the so-called conquerors rise and fall. Our next category is the wild. There is a slight leaning towards preservation. Out in the desert or on the stormy seas, there are wild creatures who have learned to endure every hardship. Some of those creatures are people. Rather than defeating or destroying the dangers of the world, we face them only when absolutely necessary and must learn to evade and outwit them in the moment. Our final group is the biggest, with a heavy leaning towards divine magic, a heavily formal religion, and a slight leaning towards accepting death. So we know that magic is for priests and saints, but more than a few villagers learn a charm or two to aid their daily labors, or protect themselves from harm. When someone draws too much power from another well, they have unknown masters, unknown goals, and should not be easily trusted. The Cantonian gods and saints have seen worship for many years in Montescaro, but the newer Montescaran saints are the most popular, and there are gods and goddesses who predate the Cantonian arrival. Those old gods have been given new names, and generations of saintly stories retrofitted to accommodate the people's attachment to the old way. Death comes easy for the fool, but without fail, it comes for us all. Best to meet it satisfied and having struck all your matches. Funerals are the time to sit with the deceased and absolve all grudges you had with them in life. Now that we have a working summary of how people feel the world should be, we can tell a few stories to bring it all into focus. We can create abridged summaries of myths and historical events that impart lessons in line with the values. These tell us how our setting came to these conclusions, and how people teach their children about them. Each of these values, especially the ones with strong or extreme leanings, should inform the others. For authority and wealth, we can say that there is a Montescaran hero and religious icon, Saint Lorenzo, who cuts the tyrant's purse. He opposed the Duke of Veronia, also called the Duke of Chains. The Duke hoarded wealth and authority, and Saint Lorenzo gave it back to the people. There was also a good prince who tried to ease the burdens of the people a little later in the timeline. He formed his cavaliers, who would ride out through the land to mete out justice upon those who treated their subjects like property instead of responsibility. The cavaliers outlasted the prince, and continue to this day. For conflict, history, and education, we can port over an old founding myth from the mother country, Cantonia, but interpreted from the Montescaran perspective that will teach us about conflict. The hero of this story will be fiery and decisive, and the villain will plot and scheme. We can also tell of a war-ending heroic charge led by people with less time, training, and resources, but whose quick action and fierce resolve turn the tides. People probably learn these stories at church and from their parents, whereas formal education is all about improving a craft or gaining membership to exclusive organizations. We can make a large university in the capital city, and we know the opinion of those outside the city is that the university is frivolous, and it does not teach you how to live. But it does produce good artists. For the wild, there are twin saints. Saint Camilla, who shelters the lost and weary, and Saint Zara, who punishes the wicked. They each wander the desert, looking for lost travelers, and it is difficult to know which one you are meeting. These can also be gods of pre-Cantonian society. The Tezcoa. Camilla was once called Cachel, and Zara was once known as Kalan. Maybe Kalan has another form, like a desert cryptid trickster beast who lures you into a trap, but you can avoid it if you know the signs. For magic, religion, and death, we can make a saint who established many of the funeral customs we know today, like close family and friends drinking a special distilled spirit and conversing with the body of the deceased to lay all grudges and unfulfilled ambitions to rest, persuading the spirit to move on. There is a force in Montescaro, probably an old Tezcoa god, that rallies the unquiet dead against those who wronged them in life. This means that things like last words are a sacred right, even among bitter enemies, because the stories say that unrealized emotions can cause the soul to linger on, an unpleasant experience for both the living and the dead. All the stories about powerful magic will be stories about the saints, and plays will use secular magic as a way to convey that a character's loyalties could go either way, although arcane magic does not equal outright villainy. More like it represents a lost soul in Montescaro, desperate for power over their misfortune, but not willing to give their lives over to the gods. In Montescaran stories, it's actually a popular and romantic archetype, but most of these characters will eventually turn to the saints for redemption. From all of that, we have a list of world-building tasks that will bring the culture to life. I can go write more about St. Lorenzo, about the cavalier's hat he wore with a golden feather from an angel, a phoenix, or a coatl. I can write about how the prince's cavaliers used feathers made of real gold in their hats to emulate St. Lorenzo, and how they outlived their prince and persist to this day as a secret force for good. I can write about the Cantonian pantheon, Canto, the creator, who gave a measure of his blood to all creatures, and those with the most of it were destined to rule. About Runa, his wife, who made safe places in the world for the weak to thrive. Of their eldest son, Viro, the lord of all horses and the one who bore the most of Canto's blood. And his younger brother, Betun, who sought to poison Viro's most powerful horse, Maro, the night-black stallion whose hooves churn the earth, in an attempt to temporarily drive the horse mad and unseat Viro, humiliating him. In this particular myth, Viro does not try to master the horse, but instead transforms into a horse himself and rides alongside it, basking in its fury. Together in their wild ride, they carve out the peninsula that would become Cantonia. Montescarans identify not with the noble-blooded hero who has the right to rule, but with the great stallion that cannot be tamed. The charge at Fort Campa, where desert couriers banded together and drove back the invading army. The Sisters of the Desert, will lead you to an oasis, but you must check your own reflection in the water to see if it will heal you or harm you. The University of Cantonova, and its 6 colleges devoted to the arts. The saints in the old world that have gained popularity here, and the many more numerous and popular Montescaran saints who have been canonized in the last few centuries, including old gods with new names. Saint Ignacio, who quiets the dead, the dragon fruit wine he brewed that erases the ego while you sit beside the recently deceased. The ghost stories that serve as a warning against leaving this life with unfinished business. This place is real to me now. I can look at what I know and make consistent assumptions to fill in any blanks. These stories, and the characters in them, can work their way into every facet of the world. Exclamations like, "St. Lorenzo's bones!" or "By the tyrant's purse!" upon seeing extravagant displays of wealth. Everyone gathering around a dying duelist to hear their last words so they can pass on in peace. A celebration to recognize the anniversary of a decisive battle. A feast to honor the deeds of a saint, or holiday from the old world that has taken on new meaning in Montescaro. One of the prince's cavaliers showing up as the underdog in a skirmish, or to aid the party in their pursuit of justice. We can even take the organizations that we've made, like the prince's cavaliers, the orders of the saints, the old noble houses of Cantonia, and the University of Cantonova, and show them to the players as potential backgrounds for their characters. Once we've done the work of establishing the culture's values, everything else falls into place pretty automatically. It is a resilient scaffolding for everything else you need to know about your setting. I would love to see how you use this spread to create your own settings culture. You can tweet at me, comment below, or come to Discord and tell me all about it. The spread will be available in a public post on my Patreon. That means anyone can see and download it. All links are in the description. There will also be a patrons-only post about my design process for this spread, scribbles and all. Thank you to my Dungeon Delver and Antediluvian Lurker tier patrons: Adam M, IronTrash, Troy, Borkware, Courtney Monster, Katie B, M, Mitch B, Raspilicious, Sam, Shawn S, Shawn M, and a very special thank you to the latest Dungeon Delver, Noah. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to the Friendship Dungeon. And as always, thank you for watching.